For as long as anyone could remember, Margaret Holloway had been the undisputed ruler of Oakwood Court. She wasn't just the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. She was its architect, its enforcer, and its self-appointed guardian. To Margaret, the neighborhood wasn't just a collection of houses, it was her kingdom, a meticulously curated vision of order and perfection. Every lawn, every mailbox, every flower bed had to conform to her exacting standards. And for years, the residents of Oakwood Court had obeyed, too intimidated or too exhausted to challenge her iron grip. Margaret's obsession with control wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about power. She reveled in the authority she wielded, the way people hesitated before painting their front doors or planting a new shrub. She had turned the HOA bylaws into a weapon, using them to enforce her will and crush any hint of dissent. But her latest crusade, a ban on outdoor food consumption, would prove to be her undoing. It began, as most of Margaret's edicts did, with a passive-aggressive comment at an HOA meeting. "Does anyone else feel like this community is becoming unruly?" she had asked, her voice dripping with faux concern. "I've noticed people eating on their lawns, their driveways, even their porches. It's unsightly. It's unhygienic. And frankly, it's bringing down the prestige of Oakwood Court." A few board members nodded absently, but most just shrugged. Eating outside. It seemed like such a trivial thing. But to Margaret, it was an affront to everything she stood for. The sight of children dripping popsicle juice on the sidewalks, or families lounging on their porches with greasy fast food bags, made her blood boil. It was messy. It was chaotic. And chaos was something Margaret could not tolerate. That night, she sat at her desk, meticulously crafting a new HOA ordinance. She titled it the Community Cleanliness and Respect Policy. In bold, underlined letters, she wrote, "Food consumption outside of designated indoor areas is strictly prohibited in Oakwood Court." The next morning, flyers went up all over the neighborhood. No eating outside. No exceptions. Margaret watched from her window, expecting immediate compliance. But nothing happened. People still ate on their porches. Children still ran down the sidewalks with ice cream cones and juice boxes. No one took her new rule seriously. Margaret was furious. She started patrolling the streets, arms crossed, glaring at anyone who dared to eat outside. She took photos, sent angry emails, and even knocked on doors, issuing stern reminders about the new regulation. But no one listened. Until one afternoon, when she saw it, a little boy, no more than 6 years old, with blonde hair and big, innocent eyes, happily licking an ice cream cone as he stood in his front yard. The boy was Ethan Carter, the son of Laura and David Carter, a family that had moved into Oakwood Court a year ago. The Carters had already clashed with Margaret over landscaping rules, mailbox restrictions, and even the wind chimes on their porch. And now, they were letting their son eat ice cream right in front of their house. To Margaret, it was a direct challenge. She marched across the street, her eyes locked onto the child like a predator spotting prey. As she got closer, Ethan looked up, his little face lighting up with excitement. "Hi, lady," he said, completely unaware of the storm about to hit him. Margaret's lips curled in disgust as she pointed at the melting ice cream. "You can't eat that outside," she snapped. Ethan blinked, confused. He looked around, as if expecting someone to explain this strange rule to him. But before he could react, Margaret snatched the cone right out of his hands. Ethan let out a small gasp, his eyes wide with shock. Margaret threw the ice cream onto the ground, letting it splatter against the pavement. "No food outside," she barked. "That is the rule, and you need to learn it." For a second, there was silence. Then Ethan's eyes filled with tears. His lower lip trembled, his little hands clenched into fists at his sides, and then he started sobbing, loud, heartbreaking cries that immediately shattered the peaceful afternoon. Margaret rolled her eyes. "Oh, for heaven's sake, stop that ridiculous noise." But before she could say anything else, the front door of the Carter house flew open. Laura Carter came storming outside, her expression a mix of confusion and absolute fury. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded. Ethan ran straight to his mother, sobbing into her legs and pointing at Margaret. "She threw my ice cream," he wailed. "She said no food outside." Laura's eyes snapped toward Margaret, her face darkening. Margaret folded her arms, standing her ground. "I'm enforcing HOA policy," she said coldly. Laura's nostrils flared. "Are you out of your damn mind?" You took ice cream from a child. Margaret lifted her chin. I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. Laura let out a harsh laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. You literally just said you made the policy. By now, neighbors were stepping outside, drawn by the commotion. People were whispering, frowning, some already pulling out their phones. Margaret could feel the scrutiny, the weight of so many eyes on her. But she wasn't backing down. This is about standards, she said firmly, looking around as if expecting the crowd to agree. If we allow food outside, soon we'll have pests, rodents, garbage everywhere. This is about preserving the integrity of our community. Someone in the crowd, Tom Reynolds, a longtime resident who had never liked Margaret, let out a bitter chuckle. Integrity? He repeated, raising an eyebrow. Margaret, you just ripped ice cream out of a 6-year-old's hands. You sound like a psychopath. A ripple of agreement spread through the gathering crowd. Margaret felt her control slipping. Her rule was being questioned. Her power was being undermined. And worst of all, people were recording. Laura bent down, wiping Ethan's tears, her voice shaking with anger. You owe my son an apology. Margaret snorted. I owe him nothing. Maybe next time, you should teach your child to respect the rules. Laura's face turned red with fury. You have no right. But before she could finish, Tom cut in loudly, holding up his phone. Oh, she's going to regret this, he muttered, filming the entire scene. Margaret felt her stomach twist. This wasn't just a small argument anymore. This was turning into something bigger, something she couldn't control. And she had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The balance of power was shifting, slipping through Margaret's fingers like sand. The weight of the neighborhood's scrutiny bore down on her, the whispers growing louder, the cameras still recording. She had never faced this much defiance all at once, and for the first time in years, she didn't know how to stop it. Laura stood with her arms crossed, her face twisted with pure disgust as she looked at Margaret like she was something rotten on the bottom of her shoe. Ethan, still sniffling beside her, gripped his mother's leg, glaring at Margaret with a mix of fear and anger only a child could manage. Margaret had expected obedience. She had expected the Carters to back down, like so many others had before them, to accept the fine, the warning, the absolute authority of the HOA. But Laura wasn't backing down, and neither was the rest of the neighborhood. Margaret straightened her spine, ignoring the way her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She had to regain control. Let me remind you all, she said, her voice dripping with forced authority, that I'm simply upholding the rules of this community. If you can't follow them, then perhaps you don't belong here. A murmur spread through the crowd, a ripple of anger that made Margaret's stomach twist uncomfortably. Tom let out a loud, bitter laugh, shaking his head. He pointed his phone right at her face. That's rich, he said. You just told a 6-year-old he doesn't belong here. Do you even hear yourself? Margaret's face burned red. That's not what I meant. Tom raised an eyebrow. Oh, because that's what it sounded like. Margaret turned toward Laura, seizing the opportunity to redirect the conversation. This isn't personal, she said, her voice tight and clipped. It's about the rules. And if you refuse to comply, there will be consequences. End of story. Laura's eyes flashed with fury. Oh, Margaret, she said, her voice low and dangerously calm. This is far from over. Margaret's stomach clenched at the way she said it. Laura turned toward the crowd again, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her neighbors. Anyone else sick of this? She called. A chorus of murmurs and nods rippled through the group. Someone in the back shouted, She's been doing this for years. Margaret felt a wave of unease roll over her. Laura turned back to her, smiling coldly. Looks like you've got more than just me to deal with now. Margaret forced herself to keep her expression blank, but inside, she was boiling with rage. She would not be challenged like this. Not by Laura Carter. Not by anyone. If you want to appeal the fine, she said, her voice sharp, you know the process. But Laura just grinned wider. Oh, I'm not appealing anything, she said, tilting her head. I'm going to fight back. Margaret blinked. Excuse me. Laura stepped closer, her voice lowering to something only Margaret could hear. I'm done playing by your rules, she said. And I think the rest of the neighborhood is, too. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Laura stepped back, raising her voice so the entire crowd could hear. Who's in favor of filing a formal complaint against Margaret? Nearly every hand in the crowd shot up. Margaret's stomach twisted into knots. Laura turned back to her, arms folded. There it is. A majority. You love rules, Margaret. Let's see how you like this one. Margaret could barely process what was happening. The crowd was against her. Her authority was crumbling before her eyes. And for the first time in her reign as HOA president, she didn't know what to do. The air shifted. The neighborhood's collective anger crystallized into something more than just whispers and frustration. This wasn't just another disagreement over HOA rules. This was an uprising, and Margaret was standing at the center of it, watching the walls close in around her. Laura Parker stood tall, arms crossed, her entire posture exuding defiance. The crowd, once hesitant and fragmented, was now united in its rage. This wasn't just about an ice cream cone anymore. This was about years of Margaret's unchecked power, her bullying, her suffocating rules. And the worst part? Margaret had no way out. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one holding the rulebook. Margaret Holloway spent the rest of the day in a state of simmering rage. The audacity of Laura Carter and the rest of the neighborhood to defy her was incomprehensible. She had spent years cultivating her authority, bending the HOA board to her will, and ensuring that when she spoke, people obeyed. And now, they were turning against her. The thought was unbearable. She retreated to her immaculately kept home, a fortress of order and control. The walls were adorned with framed certificates and awards from her time as HOA president, each one a testament to her power. But tonight, they felt like hollow reminders of a reign that was slipping through her fingers. Margaret sat at her desk, her mind racing. She needed a plan. She couldn't let this rebellion gain momentum. If the neighborhood filed a formal complaint, it could lead to an emergency vote to remove her from the HOA board. And if that happened, she would lose everything: her power, her control, her identity. She pulled out her binder of HOA regulations, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. There had to be something in the bylaws she could use to stop this. Some loophole, some technicality that would allow her to invalidate the petition. But the more she searched, the more she realized the truth. The bylaws were designed to enforce order, not to protect her from a revolt. Margaret's breath came in short, shallow bursts. She had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the rules. Now, for the first time, she felt vulnerable. But she wasn't out of options yet. If she couldn't stop the petition, she could at least control the narrative. She would call an emergency HOA meeting and present her case. She would remind the neighborhood of all she had done for them, of the order and prestige she had brought to Oakwood Court. They would see reason. They had to. The next evening, the Oakwood Court Community Center was packed. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls, their faces a mix of curiosity, anger, and determination. Margaret arrived early, her binder in hand, her clipboard tucked under her arm. She had dressed carefully, choosing a sharp blazer and heels to project authority. But as she walked into the room, she felt the weight of the crowd's gaze, and for the first time, it unnerved her. She took her place at the front of the room, setting up her materials with practiced precision. The few allies she had left, longtime residents who had always supported her, were scattered throughout the room, but their presence did little to comfort her. The atmosphere was charged, electric with tension. Laura Carter arrived last, carrying a thick folder. She gave Margaret a mocking smile as she took her seat near the front. Margaret forced herself to stay composed, rapping her knuckles on the table to quiet the crowd. "All right," she began, her voice sharp and commanding. "Let's begin. We are here tonight to address a petition that has been circulated in direct opposition to HOA governance. As HOA president, it is my duty to uphold order and fairness. And quite frankly, I believe this entire petition is nothing more than an attempted coup, fueled by personal grievances rather than legitimate community concerns." Laura leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "You mean your governance," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Margaret ignored her. "Without structure, this community would fall into absolute chaos. I have spent years maintaining order, ensuring that Oakwood Court remains a pristine and respectable neighborhood. And now, a small group of individuals is trying to undermine that." Laura let out a laugh, a real, amused laugh. "Oh, Margaret," she said, "let's cut the theatrics. No one is here because of a coup." She flipped open her folder, pulling out a thick stack of papers. "We're here because of you." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Laura held up the documents for everyone to see. These, she said, are copies of every bogus fine you've ever written. She pulled out another stack of papers. These are emails you sent to residents. Emails that aren't legally enforceable, but were worded to make people think they were. She slapped a final document onto the table. And this, she said, tapping the page, is a legal demand letter from a real estate lawyer confirming that you've been issuing fines that aren't even in the HOA bylaws. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Margaret could feel it. The shift, the undeniable truth laid bare for everyone to see. But she refused to go down quietly. These are lies, she hissed. Baseless accusations meant to. Laura cut her off, flipping over another page. Here's a signed affidavit from a former HOA board member stating that you personally altered community policies without proper approval. Margaret stopped breathing. Laura turned toward the room. Show of hands, who here has received a fine from Margaret that seemed unfair? Nearly every hand in the room went up. Margaret's chest tightened. Laura leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. That's why we're here, Margaret. Not because of a coup. Not because of personal grievances. But because you abused your power for years. And now, she smirked, you finally have to answer for it. Margaret's vision blurred at the edges. This was slipping away from her. She opened her mouth, ready to fight, ready to spin a counter-argument. But then Tom Reynolds stood up, his phone still recording. I think we've heard enough, he said. He turned to the rest of the room. Who here votes to remove Margaret Holloway from the HOA board, effective immediately? A wave of hands shot up. Margaret felt her stomach drop through the floor. Tom glanced around the room, then nodded. Well, then, he said. Looks like it's unanimous. Margaret froze. No, this couldn't be happening. She had spent years building her power, enforcing order, making sure people feared her. And now, with a single vote, she was nothing. Laura stood, picking up her folder of evidence with a satisfied smile. Enjoy retirement, Margaret, she said. Margaret gripped the table, her nails digging into the wood, her face burning with humiliation and rage. The room erupted into murmurs as neighbors filed out, talking amongst themselves. Not about her. Not anymore. They were moving on. She wasn't part of the conversation anymore. She had been erased. As she sat there, completely paralyzed by the reality of her downfall, she saw Ethan Carter skip past her, happily licking an ice cream cone. Laura leaned down beside him, whispering something with a grin. And for the first time in her miserable reign as HOA president, Margaret felt powerless. Because she was. Margaret sat in stunned silence, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. The voices around her were nothing but a muffled blur, a distant hum of conversation she was no longer a part of. It was over. The vote had passed. She was no longer HOA president. For the first time in a decade, Margaret Holloway had no power. The room continued to empty, people filing out in small clusters, their excitement palpable. The very same neighbors who once cowered under her rules, who feared her fines and her clipboard, were now laughing, hugging, celebrating. They had won. And they knew it. Margaret forced herself to breathe, her vision swimming, her entire body locked in place as she tried to process what had just happened. How had this happened? How had she lost everything? Her fingers dug into the wooden table, her nails scraping against the polished surface. She could feel the burning humiliation rising up her throat, the sting of defeat sinking deep into her chest like a knife. Laura Carter had done this to her. That arrogant, insufferable woman had turned the entire neighborhood against her. She had taken everything, and she was still smiling. Margaret looked up just in time to see Laura standing near the door, speaking with Tom Reynolds and a few others. Ethan stood beside her, his face sticky with ice cream, his little eyes bright with happiness as he waved at a friend across the room. The sight of that damn ice cream cone made Margaret's blood boil all over again. It should have been a simple rule, a minor adjustment to community standards. But instead, it had destroyed her. Margaret inhaled sharply, trying to push down the overwhelming wave of fury that threatened to consume her whole. No, she refused to let this be the end of her story. She had one last move left to play. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed herself up from her chair, smoothing the front of her blazer with practiced precision. She could feel people watching her, expecting her to explode, to lash out, to make some last desperate grasp for control. She refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead, she turned, striding toward the exit with the last shred of dignity she had left. Laura caught sight of her, raising an eyebrow. Leaving so soon? Margaret stopped, turning just enough to look at her. You may have won this round, she said, her voice calm, measured, dangerously smooth. But this isn't over. Laura smirked. Margaret, this wasn't a game. You lost. For good. Margaret didn't flinch. We'll see, she said. And with that, she turned and walked out the door, her heels clicking against the polished floors, her breath steady despite the raging fire inside her. She needed a new plan. The HOA might have been stolen from her, but she still had connections. There were still loopholes, legal angles, ways to fight back. She had ruled this neighborhood for years, and she wasn't about to fade into obscurity without a fight. If they thought they had seen the last of Margaret Holloway, they were sorely mistaken. Because revenge, after all, was best served cold. And she had nothing but time. The story isn't over. Margaret's fall from power is just the beginning. As she plots her revenge, the neighborhood braces for the fallout. Will Laura and the others be able to maintain their newfound unity, or will Margaret's cunning and ruthlessness tear them apart? The battle for Oakwood Court is far from over. In the days following the emergency meeting, Oakwood Court buzzed with a newfound sense of liberation. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now greeted one another with smiles and waves. Children played freely on the sidewalks, their laughter echoing through the streets. The oppressive shadow of Margaret Holloway had lifted, and the neighborhood felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Laura Carter became an unofficial leader of the movement, her name synonymous with the fight for freedom. She organized a community picnic to celebrate their victory, inviting everyone to gather in the park at the center of the neighborhood. It was a bold statement, a direct defiance of Margaret's old rules. Families brought blankets, coolers, and baskets of food, spreading out across the grass without a care in the world. For the first time in years, Oakwood Court felt like a community. But not everyone was celebrating. Margaret Holloway watched the festivities from the shadows of her living room, her curtains drawn just enough to give her a view of the park. The sight of her neighbors laughing, eating, and enjoying themselves without her permission filled her with a seething rage. She had built Oakwood Court into what it was. She had given them order, structure, and prestige. And now, they were throwing it all away. She paced her immaculate living room, her mind racing. She couldn't let this stand. She couldn't let them erase her legacy. But how? The neighborhood had turned against her, and her allies were few. She needed a new strategy, something subtle, something that would make them regret ever crossing her. Her eyes fell on a framed photo on the mantel, a picture of her standing proudly in front of the Oakwood Court sign, flanked by the previous HOA board members. She had been untouchable then. She would be untouchable again. Margaret's first move was subtle. She began spreading rumors, planting seeds of doubt among the residents. She called her few remaining allies, framing her actions as concern for the neighborhood's future. Have you seen how messy the park looks after the picnic? She asked one neighbor, her voice dripping with faux concern. It's only a matter of time before we have pests and rodents. And what about property values? If we let this slide, Oakwood Court will lose its prestige. To another, she said, Laura Carter may seem like a hero now, but mark my words, she's just using this to boost her own ego. Do you really want someone like her calling the shots? The rumors spread like wildfire, whispered over fences and across backyard patios. Some residents began to question whether they had made the right decision. Others dismissed Margaret's words as the bitter ramblings of a fallen tyrant. But the seeds had been planted. The first real casualty of Margaret's campaign was Brenda Holloway, one of her former allies. Brenda had always been a stickler for the rules, believing in the importance of order and structure. But even she had grown tired of Margaret's overreach and had signed the petition to remove her from the HOA board. Margaret knew Brenda's weakness, her pride. She called Brenda late one night, her voice soft and sympathetic. I just wanted to check in on you, she said. I know how much you care about this neighborhood. It must be hard to see it falling apart like this. Brenda hesitated. It's not falling apart, she said. People are just enjoying themselves. For now, Margaret replied. But without rules, chaos will follow. And when it does, people will look for someone to blame. Someone like you. Brenda's breath hitched. What are you saying? I'm saying that Laura Carter is using you, Margaret said. She's the one who started this rebellion. But when things go wrong, she'll point the finger at you. You've always been a rule follower, Brenda. People will believe her. The call ended with Brenda's mind racing. The next day, she withdrew her support for Laura, citing personal reasons. It was a small victory for Margaret, but it was enough to sow discord. Laura Carter was no fool. She saw the cracks forming in the neighborhood's newfound unity and knew exactly who was behind them. But confronting Margaret directly would only give her more ammunition. Instead, Laura focused on strengthening the community's bond. She organized a neighborhood cleanup day, inviting everyone to come together and maintain the park. "This is our home," she said at the gathering. "We've fought for the right to enjoy it, but that also means taking responsibility for it. Let's show everyone what Oakwood Court is really about." The turnout was impressive, with families working side by side to pick up litter, trim bushes, and repaint benches. For a moment, it seemed like the neighborhood had found its footing. But Laura couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The breaking point came on a quiet Sunday evening. Tom Reynolds, one of Laura's staunchest supporters, received an anonymous letter in the mail. It was a photocopy of a document from the HOA archives, detailing a complaint filed against him years ago for an unkempt lawn. The complaint had been dismissed, but the letter included a handwritten note. "Do you really want someone like Laura Carter in charge? She's already digging up dirt on her allies." Tom was furious. He stormed over to Laura's house, waving the letter in her face. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "Are you trying to sabotage me?" Laura was stunned. "Tom, I have no idea what you're talking about. I would never." "Then who sent this?" he interrupted. "Because it sure as hell wasn't Margaret. She's been quiet ever since the vote." Laura's heart sank. She realized then that Margaret wasn't just spreading rumors. She was playing a dangerous game, pitting neighbor against neighbor. And it was working. The tension in Oakwood Court reached a boiling point. Neighbors who had once stood together now eyed each other with suspicion. Laura knew she had to act fast before Margaret's schemes tore the community apart. She called an emergency meeting, this time to address the growing distrust. "We've come too far to let Margaret Holloway divide us," she said, her voice firm. "She's trying to turn us against each other because she knows that's the only way she can win. But we're stronger than that. We have to be." The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Slowly, people began to nod. Tom stood up, his expression grim. "You're right," he said. "I let my anger get the best of me. But we can't let her win. Not again." The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose. But as Laura walked home that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was still one step ahead. Margaret watched from her window as the neighborhood rallied once again. She had hoped to break them, to make them turn on each other. But they were stronger than she had anticipated. It was time for a new strategy. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "It's me," she said when the call connected. "I need your help." On the other end of the line, a voice replied, "What do you need?" Margaret smiled. "I need to remind them who's really in charge. The battle for Oakwood Court is far from over. Margaret's endgame is set in motion, and the neighborhood must brace for the fallout. Will Laura and the others be able to withstand Margaret's final assault, or will her cunning and ruthlessness tear them apart? The stakes have never been higher. Margaret Holloway's plan was as meticulous as it was ruthless. She had spent weeks gathering information, exploiting weaknesses, and manipulating the few allies she had left. But now, it was time to make her move. She had called in a favor from an old friend, a lawyer named Victor Grayson, who specialized in real estate law and had a reputation for winning at all costs. Victor arrived at Margaret's house late one evening, his briefcase in hand and a calculating gleam in his eye. "You've got yourself in quite a mess," he said as he sat down at her dining table. "But I think I can help you clean it up." Margaret smiled. "I knew I could count on you." Victor opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. "I've reviewed the HOA bylaws, and there's a clause that could work in your favor. It states that any decision made by the HOA board can be challenged if there's evidence of coercion or improper influence during the voting process." Margaret's eyes lit up. "You're saying we can overturn the vote?" Victor nodded. "If we can prove that Laura Carter or her allies pressured residents into signing the petition, we can invalidate the results. And once that happens, you'll be reinstated as HOA president." Margaret leaned back in her chair, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. "Perfect." The next morning, Oakwood Court residents received a formal notice in the mail. It was a legal challenge to the petition that had removed Margaret from the HOA board, citing irregularities in the voting process. The notice demanded a formal hearing, where evidence would be presented to determine whether the petition was valid. Laura Carter was furious when she read the notice. She called an emergency meeting with her closest allies, including Tom Reynolds and Brenda Holloway. "This is Margaret's doing," she said, slamming the notice down on the table. "She's trying to turn this into a legal battle because she knows she can't win in the court of public opinion." Tom frowned. "Do we have anything to worry about? The petition was legitimate." Laura sighed. "I don't know. Margaret's resourceful and she's got a good lawyer. We need to be prepared for anything." Brenda, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "What if we counter her move? We could gather evidence of her abuses, the bogus fines, the intimidation tactics, everything. If we can show that she's unfit to lead, maybe we can stop this before it goes any further." Laura nodded. "It's worth a shot. Let's get to work." The hearing was held in the Oakwood Court Community Center, the same room where Margaret had been ousted just weeks earlier. The atmosphere was tense, with residents filling every seat and spilling out into the hallway. Margaret sat at the front of the room, flanked by Victor Grayson, her expression calm and composed. Laura and her allies sat on the opposite side, their faces set with determination. Victor opened the proceedings by presenting his case. He argued that the petition had been circulated under false pretenses, with Laura and her allies pressuring residents into signing it. He called several witnesses to the stand, including Brenda Holloway, who reluctantly admitted that she had felt pressured to support the petition. Laura's heart sank as she watched the proceedings. Margaret's strategy was working. She was painting Laura as a manipulator who had undermined the democratic process. But Laura wasn't ready to give up. When it was her turn to present her case, Laura stood and addressed the room. "Margaret Holloway has spent years abusing her power," she said, her voice steady. "She issued fines for things that weren't in the bylaws, intimidated residents into compliance, and manipulated the rules to suit her own agenda. The petition wasn't about coercion. It was about holding her accountable for her actions." She called several witnesses of her own, including Tom Reynolds and other residents who had been unfairly targeted by Margaret. She presented documents, emails, and even security footage that showed Margaret's aggressive behavior. The evidence was damning. After hours of testimony and deliberation, the hearing came to a close. The arbitrator, a neutral third party hired to oversee the proceedings, stood to deliver the verdict. "This has been a difficult case," the arbitrator said, with strong arguments on both sides. However, after reviewing the evidence, it is clear that the petition to remove Margaret Holloway from the HOA board was a legitimate expression of the community's will. While there were some concerns about the process, they do not outweigh the overwhelming evidence of Ms. Holloway's misconduct. The room erupted into cheers. Margaret's face turned pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. Victor Grayson leaned over and whispered something in her ear, but she shook her head, her expression one of stunned disbelief. The arbitrator continued, "Therefore, I rule that the petition is valid, and Margaret Holloway will not be reinstated as HOA president. Furthermore, I recommend that the HOA board review its bylaws to ensure that such abuses of power cannot occur in the future." Margaret left the hearing in silence, her head held high, but her spirit broken. She returned to her immaculate home, the walls now feeling more like a prison than a fortress. She had lost everything: her power, her control, her identity. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone. The neighborhood, meanwhile, celebrated their hard-fought victory. Laura Carter was hailed as a hero, but she knew the real victory belonged to the community. They had come together, stood up to a tyrant, and reclaimed their freedom. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board was restructured, with Laura taking on a leadership role. New bylaws were drafted to ensure transparency and fairness, and the neighborhood began to heal. The park, once a symbol of Margaret's control, became a gathering place for families and friends, a testament to the power of unity. Months later, Oakwood Court was thriving. The sense of community was stronger than ever, and the residents had learned to balance freedom with responsibility. Laura Carter stood in the park, watching as children played and neighbors chatted, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. Margaret Holloway, meanwhile, had become a recluse. She rarely left her house, and when she did, she avoided eye contact with her neighbors. The once feared HOA president was now a ghost, a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked. As the sun set over Oakwood Court, Laura took a deep breath, savoring the moment. The battle had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. The neighborhood was finally free, and it was beautiful. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.